Hello and welcome to lecture number 45. This is topic 3.10, HBCUs, Black Greek letter organizations, and Black education. There are two learning objectives today, and the first one is to describe the founding of historically Black colleges and universities in the late 19th and 20th early centuries. The reason why HBCUs were created were due to discrimination that was prevalent in education. The public school system after the Civil War, or those established during Reconstruction, were segregated even before state laws mandated segregation. By the end of the Civil War, there were only 5 white colleges that accepted Black students. One of the prominent ones was Oberlin College, which was founded in 1833. It was originally established as a co-ed college, which at the time was radical in itself, and it admitted its first Black student in 1835. In fact, Oberlin was the first institution in the U.S. to grant degrees to Black women, starting with Mary Jane Patterson in 1862. This discrimination led to African Americans founding their own colleges, most of which were established after the Civil War. Some were started with the help of philanthropic or charitable organizations like the American Missionary Association, working in tandem with the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction. These two organizations established Fisk University, Talladega College, and Avery College. The Lincoln Institute was founded by Black veterans named after the recently deceased President Lincoln. There was also religious organizations that helped establish colleges on their own. Examples include Shaw University, Morehouse College, and Rusk College, which have affiliations with different Protestant sects like Baptists or Methodists. Additionally, there was some public funding used to start HBCUs. A famous example here is Alcorn A&M in Mississippi, established in 1872 by state legislatures using federal money from the Morrill Land Grant Act. Alcorn is notable as the first Black land-grant college in the U.S. Now let's look at how many HBCUs were originally private colleges and universities established by large white philanthropists. Alcorn A&M, although it was established with public funds, was named after the white governor of Mississippi. Hampton Agricultural and Industrial School and the Tuskegee Institute were also the works of white leaders who spearheaded their founding, although the Tuskegee Institute was led by Booker T. Washington. By the end of the 19th century, during the Gilded Age, wealthy industrialists such as the heads of corporations like Carnegie Steel or Sears Roebuck funded some of these institutions as a form of charity. Andrew Carnegie, for example, donated over $600,000 to Tuskegee, including for the construction of a library. Wilberforce University, established in Ohio in 1856, stands apart because it was founded by leaders of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or the AME Church. It became the first university to be fully owned and operated by African Americans. It was named after William Wilberforce, the English statesman who led the movement to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. Its president, Daniel Payne, became the first African American to serve as a university president in the United States. Wilberforce was extremely important in training Black ministers and educators, which helped build a strong foundation for African American leadership in the late 19th century. In 1890, the Second Morrill Act was passed, and this followed the first Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862, which allowed states to use money from land sales to establish colleges and universities. The original act primarily benefited white students, as most of the newly established institutions either excluded or severely restricted Black students. The Second Morrill Act not only allowed states to continue using federal money to establish colleges, focusing on agriculture and mechanical or teacher training, but it also required states to demonstrate that race was not a factor in admissions, and if states continued to segregate educational institutions, they had to create separate institutions for Black students to receive federal funding. This requirement led to the establishment of 18 HBCUs as land-grant institutions under the Second Morrill Act, including Florida A&M University, Southern University in Louisiana, and Langston University in Oklahoma. These schools became vital for providing higher education to Black students in the segregated South. By 1900, these land-grant HBCUs were among the few higher education institutions available to Southern Blacks, as many Southern states had limited access to public education for African Americans. These land-grant institutions often focused on vocational and agricultural training, reflecting the broader goal of the Morrill Acts to promote practical skills. However, they also became spaces where Black students could pursue higher academic achievement and leadership development. Over time, many of these institutions expanded their curricula to include liberal arts education, engineering, and professional programs, becoming key drivers of economic and social mobility for African Americans. Florida A&M, for instance, grew into one of the largest and most prestigious HBCUs in the country, known for its programs in law, pharmacy, and engineering. The Second Morrill Act, although born out of the segregationist policies of the time, ultimately contributed to the establishment of essential education institutions for African Americans. The educational models implemented by HBCUs fell into one or two categories, reflecting the debates between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. The first model was liberal arts education, promoted by Du Bois. This was the model most private black colleges adopted, including the study of Latin, Greek, mathematics, and natural sciences. It was practiced at institutions like Fisk University and Morehouse College. On the other hand, there was vocational or industrial training largely supported by Washington. This model, used primarily by A&M schools, focused on agricultural methods and skilled labor. Critics argued that it kept African Americans in subordinate roles, but Washington and his supporters saw it as a path to economic independence. Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895 encapsulated this approach, emphasizing economic self-reliance over the direct civil rights advocacy. HBCUs were the primary providers of post-secondary education for African Americans until the 1960s. By 1950, HBCUs had produced over 70% of all black college graduates, highlighting their critical role in shaping the black intellectual class. They also fostered environments where African American students could learn about their own cultural contributions in black history. Professor Leo Hansberry at Howard University was one of the leading proponents of accurate African history. Lorenzo Dow Turner, a linguist at Fisk University, studied the Gullah language in the Carolina Low Country, preserving an important element of African cultural retention in the U.S. It wasn't until the 1960s, with the rise of the black student movements at public institutions, that more black students began attending predominantly white institutions, or PWIs. By 1970, over 100,000 African American students were attending PWIs, a significant increase due to the civil rights movement and desegregation policies. From 1960 to 1977, attendance of black students at these institutions increased by 500%. The second learning objective is to explain how the creation of HBCUs impacted the educational and professional lives of African Americans, both nationally and internationally. HBCUs had a significant economic impact, transforming African Americans' access to higher education and professional training. Some HBCUs even offered high school programs, allowing students to receive secondary and post-secondary education in one place. This was crucial for students from areas where secondary education was either unavailable or restricted to white students. HBCUs helped many rise out of poverty, creating generations of professionals such as lawyers, doctors, teachers, and ministers. These new vocations generated intergenerational wealth despite the barriers imposed by Jim Crow laws. HBCUs also produced notable alumni who became leaders in civil rights and politics. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. attended Morehouse College in Atlanta, Thurgood Marshall did his undergrad at Lincoln University and got his law degree at Howard, Vice President Kamala Harris attended Howard University, and civil rights leader John Lewis attended Fisk University. By the 1960s, HBCUs had become the training ground for a significant portion of the leaders of the civil rights movement. The impact of HBCUs extended beyond just professional success. They created spaces for cultural pride, celebrated historical achievements, and promoted black scholarship. They also played a crucial role in preserving African American music and culture. The Fisk Jubilee Singers, for instance, preserved the tradition of spirituals and introduced it to a global audience. Their tours helped raise awareness about African American history and struggles, serving as cultural ambassadors to Europe and beyond. HBCUs were centers of activism during the civil rights movement. For example, students at North Carolina A&T led the Greensboro sit-ins at the Woolworth lunch counters, which sparked a movement to integrate public spaces nationwide. Finally, HBCUs addressed racial equity gaps in higher education, encouraging more black students to pursue advanced degrees. By the early 21st century, HBCUs accounted for nearly 25% of all black graduates who want to earn advanced degrees. Next, we'll discuss Black Greek Letter Organizations, or BGLOs. These emerged at both HBCUs and PWIs to provide support for black students who are often marginalized at predominantly white institutions. BGLOs were critical in fostering a sense of community and solidarity, especially during a time when African American students faced racial isolation and exclusion from white fraternities and sororities. The first BGLO was Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, established in 1906 at Cornell University. It was formed to address the lack of support and guidance for black men in higher education and soon expanded to other campuses, including HBCUs. Alpha Phi Alpha was followed by Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, established in 1908 at Howard University, becoming the first sorority founded by and for Black women. African Americans found these organizations to be spaces for mutual support, promoting values such as self-improvement, educational excellence, leadership, and lifelong commitment to community service. These organizations also served as powerful networks, connecting members across the nation and offering mentorship, which was particularly important for Black students navigating higher education and later professional careers. They created traditions such as step shows, hand signs, and the wearing of Greek letters on clothing and jackets. Each organization adopted distinctive colors and symbols that represented their values. The step shows were a form of percussive dances that originated in African traditions and became a unique way for BGLOs to celebrate their heritage and express pride in their organization. These organizations also celebrated their history, honoring prominent members at annual events. Some of these organizations hold memorials every year to honor recently deceased alumni. Some of the most prominent alumni of HBCUs were also members of Black Greek letter organizations. Notably, Martin Luther King Jr. was a member of Alpha Phi Alpha at Morehouse College. Other significant Alpha Phi Alpha members include Thurgood Marshall, the first Black Supreme Court Justice, and Paul Robeson, the famed athlete, actor, and civil rights activist. Alpha Kappa Alpha similarly has had a lasting impact. One of its most prominent members is Vice President Kamala Harris, who joined the sorority during her time at Howard University. AKA members have been instrumental in advancing causes related to education, healthcare, and social justice for African American communities, continuing the legacy of service that defines BGLOs. Following Alpha Phi Alpha and Alpha Kappa Alpha, several other fraternities and sororities were founded, such as Kappa Alpha Psi in 1911 and Delta Sigma Theta in 1913, both of which have long histories of contributing to civil rights and educational advocacy. Finally, BGLOs are also sometimes referred to as the Divine Nine, a nickname they took on when they formed the National Pan-Hellenic Council in response to their exclusion from fraternal federations led by white groups. Lastly, we'll talk about the Fisk Jubilee Singers. This student choir from Fisk University was composed of many formerly enslaved individuals or children of enslaved parents. Organized in 1871 by University Treasurer and music professor George L. White, the choir's primary mission was to raise money for the financially struggling university, which had been founded in 1866 to educate freedmen after the Civil War. Fisk faced significant financial difficulties, and the Jubilee Singers' fundraising efforts became critical to its survival. The performances featured spirituals, songs that originated from the religious experience of enslaved Africans, and introduced this deeply emotional and historical significant music to white audiences, who are largely unfamiliar with it. The Fisk Jubilee Singers toured the US and Europe, and their dignified presentations of spirituals helped to challenge stereotypical and demeaning minstrel shows that were prevalent at the time. The choir's efforts saved Fisk University from closure and funded the construction of Jubilee Hall. Jubilee Hall still stands today and is designated as a National Historic Landmark. In 1872, they performed for President Ulysses S. Grant at the White House, marking a significant moment in the recognition of Black cultural contributions. The following year, in 1873, they performed for Queen Victoria in England, making a lasting impression on international audiences. Their performance in front of Queen Victoria is said to have been so moving that she commissioned a painting of the singers, solidifying their international acclaim. Their contribution to preserving spirituals helped cement this music as a cornerstone of African American cultural history. The spirituals they performed were eventually recognized as a critical part of American musical canon, influencing genres such as gospel, blues, jazz, and even elements of classical music. Their success also inspired other HBCUs to form similar choirs, further spreading the influence of African American spirituals. And to recap, African Americans established their own colleges and universities in response to exclusion from white institutions after the Civil War. Initially, HBCUs were funded by white philanthropists and later by public funds through the Second Morrill Act. Two educational models dominated: liberal arts education and vocational training. HBCUs provided the majority of post-secondary education for Black Americans until the 1960s, and they transformed Black education. They nurtured cultural pride and promoted Black scholarship. BGLOs added the community experience at both HBCUs and predominantly white institutions. Finally, the Fisk Jubilee Singers demonstrated the cultural and educational possibilities created by HBCUs. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/AFAM. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.